Thank you very much. Before I talk about Vin Scully, I would just like to congratulate two of the really great stars in here tonight. And of course, that's Dana and David Pump, and all that their foundation has done in the battle against cancer, and all that they have done for Northridge Hospital. I'm always pleased to be asked to say a few words about Vin Scully. When you come here, as I did in 1973 as a young announcer, and you realize that Vin Scully has set the standard for play-by-play announcing, not only in Southern California, but throughout the nation. He not only describes the game to you, he chats with you about it, like he's your best friend sitting right with you in the rec room or family room, watching and listening to the game. There is a current issue of Sports Illustrated that's out right now, their 60th anniversary issue. If you haven't had a chance to read it, there's a great article by Steve Rushin. It's 27 pages long, so it takes a while to get through it. But he talks about the story of sports and sports broadcasting in the last 60 years, and Vin Scully is kind of the focal point of the article. And in the article, Vin Scully is called the greatest storyteller in sports broadcast history, and rightfully so. I was very fortunate several years ago when Chick Hearn was alive to be on a panel show with Vin and Chick and myself. Vin sat on the left, Chick in the middle, I was on the right. Bill McDonald did the interview, and there was a lull in the conversation, and I said, look at the rings on these guys' fingers. So Vin said, this is World Series, 1988. Chick said, this is the NBA championship, 1987. Now the camera came to me. The Kings hadn't won anything yet. So I'm not sure what to say, but I said, this is my wedding ring, 1963. Vin joined the Dodgers in 1950, and he has set a record for longevity of any sports announcer with any one team in sports broadcasting history. He has also, as you heard earlier, and you all know, announced that he's coming back next year for his 66th season. Now, a lot of people have asked me, Bob, are you going to go as long as Vin Scully? I said, let me see. He's going into his 66th season. This is my 42nd year with the Kings, so there's a 24-year gap. At my age, if he quits next year, I'll tie him when I'm 100 years old. So he has had a very distinguished and outstanding career. Vin, congratulations.
What a group here tonight. So many memories among all the guests that we have here tonight, and now we're honoring a man who probably has given this city more wonderful memories than anybody else. And I'm going to come at this a little bit differently, not as someone who lives in Los Angeles, but as someone who has actually worked with Vin Scully. Yes, even in baseball games and Dodger Stadium, but also Vin Scully, for you youngsters, was one of the best NFL play-by-play announcers that we ever had back in the 70s. You could always tell that Vin Scully was in the booth because he was so detailed about everything. I've been around a lot of announcers, Hall of Famers all. Two more are going to come out here tonight, Al Michaels and Bob Costas. But no one that I have ever seen or worked with has ever come to a broadcast more prepared than Vin Scully. And when he decided that he was going to step away from the National Football League and CBS, the last game that he broadcast was one of the classics, an NFL championship game in the NFC, in the National Football Conference, between the Dallas Cowboys and the San Francisco 49ers. Cowboys were favored, but Joe Montana and the 49ers had other ideas. The NFL today was down on the field, and we were getting ready for the postgame show, but everything was up in the air. Cowboys had the lead, but Montana was driving the 49ers. I was about at midfield, and I had to go to the other end of the field to set up Phyllis and Irv, but I so wanted to see what Montana was going to do. And I remember looking from behind at about the 45 as I was making my way back, and I saw Montana throw the ball, and I thought, he's throwing it into the stands. And all of a sudden, this enormous, enormous roar erupted, and I realized that a 49er receiver had caught the ball. But it wasn't until I heard Vin Scully's great call on Dwight Clark making that catch that I knew who had caught it, and we got the pregame and the postgame show underway for the next day and everything that followed behind it. But what a game to end your NFL career on. One of the greatest games ever played, and it was Vin Scully working alongside the analyst Hank Stram. And then another time, I was with CBS Radio, and we brought the great Vin Scully in to do the All-Star game here in Dodger Stadium. And of course, I was the analyst, unquote. And when you're the analyst with Mr. Scully at a baseball game, that's kind of an oxymoron. So I knew, get in, get out. Make leads here, do the promos, go on about your business. Game was scoreless through 2. And Bob Welch, the late Bob Welch, came in to pitch for the National League. Willie Randolph, New York Yankees second baseman, slapped a single. And as you know, when a base runner gets on, time kind of slows. Steve Sachs can tell you how the pitchers take their time. Randolph, fully capable of stealing second base. So I thought, now's my time. So I began to tell the legendary Vin Scully, who knew more about the Dodgers than anybody, how Bob Welch had been working on this pickoff move. It was a snap throw, and before I could complete the sentence, Welch had picked Willie Randolph off second base. Now I'm at the microphone, so I go ahead and describe the pickoff. And in the dark of the night of Montana, when I've had a couple of beers, I tell my children, I stole an out from the great Vin Scully in Dodger Stadium one night. How did Vinny react? Pause, and went on describing Rod Carew as the next batter in the box. So for Vinny, if he'd ever like to come and steal a touchdown from me in Tuscaloosa, I'll be very glad to have him in the booth. He is a marvelous, marvelous announcer. By far the best baseball announcer I have ever heard. And the other night, when we were in Montana, now you people in Los Angeles, you have celebrities and you have great concerts and actors and musicians all the time. But we were treated to the farewell tour of Paul McCartney. Small football stadium in Missoula, wonderful, closed in, 25,000 people, so appreciative. McCartney responded with one of the great concerts that I've ever heard, The Sound Through the Night. Hey Jude, echoing through. And as we were driving home, my boys who lived in Los Angeles as little boys and had season tickets to all the Dodger games, we began to talk about the great sounds through the night. And no one has ever been any better than Mr. Scully here in Los Angeles. The reason I'm here tonight is because of him, what he means to this industry. You are so blessed to have him here in Los Angeles, and I hope he never, ever even learns how to spell the word retirement. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, we have 2 more internationally acclaimed broadcasters here to honor you, Vin. These gentlemen have been newsmakers in their own right. Al Michaels. Worked with NBC, ABC, and is best known for his play-by-play calling for NFL games, including 2 years with Monday Night Football. And Bob Costas, been the primetime host of the Olympic Games, has been a long-time play-by-play host for the MLB Network, has his own show called Studio 42 with Bob Costas, and has probably covered every sport in the industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Al Michaels and Bob Costas.
I am one of the few people in this room, maybe the only one, and one of the few in the world that has heard Vin Scully's entire career. I grew up in Brooklyn. I lived 10 blocks from Ebbets Field. My father walked me over there when I was about 4 or 5. Fell in love with the Dodgers, fell in love with sports. So I have heard Vinny from the time he started until today. He has been a gigantic influence in my life and career. I wanted to get into broadcasting basically because I could hear Vin Scully's voice as a kid growing up. And when I got my first very big break announcing minor league baseball for the Hawaii Islanders of the Pacific Coast League back in 1968, I was very nervous. And on the plane to Hawaii, all I kept thinking to myself was, just sound like Vin Scully. And that was how I was able to get through the first couple of weeks in Hawaii. One of those games was against the Spokane Indians, managed by Tommy Lasorda, believe it or not. So I grew up wanting to become a broadcaster, loving baseball, building my career around it. And my dream was to someday succeed Vin Scully as the voice of the Dodgers. So here we are in 2014, and I want to know how in hell I am going to retire before Vin Scully. He is a freak of nature. I can only think of like Chick Hearn, who we all knew in this town for many, many years. And when I listen to Vinny, and the voice is the same. The enthusiasm is unbelievable. The preparation, as Brent said, is amazing. And just to hear him say, I mean, how many times do we have to hear it? But it's the same thrill. It's time for Dodger baseball. And that's been Vinny's opening line for so many years. And you just love it. And, you know, God forbid the day ever comes when we don't hear it. And he's been such an influence that the only hot dogs I will ever eat are Farmer John, all beef wieners, because they're easternmost in quality and westernmost in flavor. How many wieners do you think Vin Scully has sold in his life? You know, I'm driving around just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm listening to Vinny, and it's like, this is a time warp. I mean, where am I? Am I in Brooklyn? Am I 10? What's going on here? This can't be. It's like you can't even believe this is still going on. But there he is, and the greatest thing about it is not only is he describing the game for you and telling you exactly what's happening, but I'm learning something. I've seen baseball for 1,000,000 years, and Vinny keeps saying things I hadn't thought about or knew about. How is that possible? And that is why there's no question in my mind the greatest baseball broadcaster of all time. Let me bring up my partner in crime, another pretty good baseball broadcaster as well, and my co-star in the Academy Award-winning Basketball back in 2002, Bob Costas.
Well, the less said about basketball, the better. We could be here all night talking about Vin Scully and still not exhaust all the superlatives that rightly apply. But to me, the thing I like best about Vin is that he still refers to me as that promising newcomer. And why not? He announced, as has been noted about a week ago, that next year he'll be back for his 66th season. The only Americans who have a job for life are Supreme Court justices, Vin Scully, and Donald Sterling's attorneys. All of us, at least all of us in the business, in some way, have some personal connection to Vin Scully. I don't know why I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, and I stumbled across the fact that Vin Scully and my father were born on the same day. Not the same birthday, exactly the same day, November 29th, 1927. And like a lot of kids, especially kids who grew up in the 50s and 60s, Baseball was a bond between me and my dad. And I grew up in New York, and I've spent a good part of my adult life in St. Louis. But when I was 8 and 9 years old, we lived in Redondo Beach. And so we moved, and the moving vans came to Long Island and took our belongings away. And my mother and my sister flew out ahead to prepare things, but we had to get the car across country. And so I drove with my dad. He did the driving. I was 8. And he and I drove across country, a 5-day trip in 1960 through an America that was very different than the one we'd find today. In some sense, less homogenized. There wasn't a Starbucks on every corner, or an Applebee's or McDonald's. And so each area had its own distinctive feel as the terrain and the landscape changed. But from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Indiana to Illinois to Missouri and on, what stitched it together was baseball on the radio. It was summertime, and I would get to sit there while my dad drove and told me baseball stories, and we compared players and ideas about the game, and I would fiddle with the radio dial like a safecracker, trying to pull in a distant broadcast. Bob Prince on KDKA in Pittsburgh, Ernie Harwell on WJR in Detroit, Bob Elson calling the White Sox games, the great team of Harry Carey and Jack Buck on KMOX in St. Louis. And as this long trip began to near its conclusion, I guess we got as far as Nevada. And through the crackle and static came the most distinctive voice of all. And I can still hear my dad, who passed away when I was a senior in high school in 1970, but I could still hear him on that summer night in 1960 say, "We're getting closer. That's Vin Scully." That's the first time I ever heard Vin Scully's voice. It's a memory that connects me to the game and to my dad, a memory that I will never forget. And I became one of those proverbial youngsters, and there are, to hear them tell a story, probably millions of them, who grew up in Southern California before modern technology allowed you to tap into any broadcast from anywhere. I had the transistor radio under the pillow with the lights out, my mom and dad thinking I was asleep, and I was listening to Vin Scully and Jerry Doggett. And so you can imagine the thrill that it was when years and years later, in the early 1980s, fate placed me at NBC hosting the pregame show before the World Series. And after setting the scene and talking about my favorite sport and the biggest stage of that sport, to me, the single biggest thrill of that night was to utter the line, turning it over to the play-by-play booth where Vin was working with Joe Garagiola. And now, here's Vin Scully. Some 20 years later, I'm interviewing Ray Charles. Now think about this. Ray Charles, and by the way, he has a connection to two people in this room. Sugar Ray Leonard, his given name is Ray Charles Leonard. And in the rematch with Roberto Duran at the Superdome in New Orleans in 1980, the fight was over as soon as the great Ray Charles sang "America the Beautiful," and the whole place went crazy. It was at that point that Duran decided to say "no mas." And Jamie Foxx, he didn't just play Ray Charles, he was Ray Charles, and one of the most startling performances in a biopic that you could ever imagine. So here I am interviewing Ray Charles, one of the great artists of the century. And at one point, Ray says to me, "You know who I'd like to meet?" And I'm thinking, who could it possibly be? You're Ray Charles. You probably met everybody. He said, "I would love to meet Vin Scully. Can you introduce me to Vin Scully?" He said, "Bob, you have to remember, the picture means nothing to me. Only the sound matters. And Vin Scully's broadcasts have a melody to them." And so it took a few years, but we arranged it. And I brought Ray to Dodger Stadium. And of course, Vin was very respectful of Ray's status, and he knew Georgia and Born to Lose and What I Say, and he talked to Ray Charles about it. But it was not an equal exchange. Vin appreciated the occasion. Ray was overjoyed. He was like a kid sitting next to Vin Scully, Tell me again about Sandy Koufax's perfect game. Tell me about Kirk Gibson's home run. Ray Charles, that's what Vin Scully meant to him. Sports broadcasting is a craft. To do it well is harder than it looks. Not that many have mastered that craft. Fewer still, truly a select few, have elevated that craft to an art form. But that's what Vin Scully has been doing now for 6.5 decades. So just as it was a thrill for a wet behind-the-ears kid more than 30 years ago to say, here is Vin Scully, tonight, in a different place at a different time, it's my honor to say, ladies and gentlemen, Vin Scully.
And good evening to you. It's a wonderful evening, and I would like to take the opportunity for the moment to thank the dinner committee for having this dinner following the Dodgers winning 3 out of 4 from the Angels. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I would also like to thank, more importantly, not only my fellow broadcasters, but my friends. And I thank you for all the wonderful things that you said, and I've listened to every word, and I appreciated it, and I will not believe one word of it. There was a minister in the Anglican Church. His name was William Archibald Spooner. And it belongs to all of us because he was a very brilliant mind, but he had some problems with his words. And because he was brilliant, he was asked to give the invocation for Queen Victoria in a rather important state dinner. And the time came, and William Archibald Spooner stood up and gave a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful tribute to the Queen. And then he said, and so, let's glaze our asses to the queer old Dean. A hush fell over the dining room. And he said, I mean, let's raise our glasses to the dear old Queen. That's the occupational hazard that all of us have. There's also a hazard in television. I learned that lesson. It was in Brooklyn, bottom of the ninth. The Dodgers were losing, it's ever so. And they had the tying run on base and the possible winning run on deck. And the hitter to prolong the game with 2 outs was a Hall of Fame outfielder named Duke Snider. The first pitch to Duke Snider was ball 1, and I noticed the first base coach of Brooklyn kind of went like that. Now, Roy Campanella is the big man. He's waiting on deck. The next pitch is ball 2, and Jake Pittler bends down, picks up a handful of dirt, throws it high in the air. The next pitch is ball 3. The crowd's roaring. Jake takes his hat off, white hair glistening in the lights, and does a little dance. Scully gets an idea. I said to the assistant director, 3-0 pitch, take a close-up of Jake Pittler, the coach. I know Snider is not going to swing 3-0. So they took a big picture of Jake Pittler. And I said, whatever you do, watch his reaction. Just watch his reaction. You'll know right away where the pitch is. And I was calling people off the streets. I was calling them out of bathrooms. I was calling them out of bedrooms to watch Jake Hitler's reaction. And the next pitch was outside. And Jake began to adjust his clothing in a most personal area. And I had to say ball 4. About 2 or 3 days later, I was walking into the clubhouse, and I heard Jake's voice. "Hey, Scully." I said, "Yeah, Jake." "What do you say about me on television?" I said, "What?" He said, he held up a can of Johnson & Johnson baby powder and said, "I got this in the mail. Try answering that after your telecast." All of us, and the fellas have been just great. I really do appreciate them coming here. I appreciate the words. I really appreciate what Dave and Dana have done, what they continue to do. As it says, honor thy mother and thy father, and they have certainly done and continue to do just that. I learned a great lesson very early in my career. I think it was my first World Series. Somebody hit a home run, and I called the home run. And then, as the network always does, they show it again. And I thought, well, I've just called it, so why do I have to say it's a home run? So I didn't say anything. And a newspaper columnist wrote, perhaps Vin Scully made his greatest contribution by saying nothing. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that's absolutely true. I can't compete with the enthusiasm and the roar of the crowd. And as a little boy, when I was 8 years old, which is shortly after the discovery of fire, I used to listen to crowd roar, and it absolutely gave me goosebumps from head to toe. And so, to this day, if there's a trademark of mine, the thing I do best of all is when I say nothing. And I said nothing for 1 minute and 30 seconds when the great Henry Aaron broke Babe Ruth's record, and it gave me a chance to think about just how important that home run was, not only to the team and the city and the state, but to all of this great country. And the other time was my greatest contribution in 65 years to the Dodgers. It was the World Series in 1988, and it's the 9th inning, bottom of the 9th. The Dodgers are losing, of course. And all of a sudden I had an idea, so I asked the producer, we were in commercial, and I said, do me a favor, follow me. Now I know he's busy on the phone trying to get the time for the Midwest and the East following the game. So we had the mandatory shot from the blimp, and then it came down into the ballpark, and I said, if you had field glasses, you'd be looking in the Dodger dugout. Wham, there's the shot of the dugout, and the pan now of the dugout. I'm looking for Kirk Gibson, but I don't say it. And as the camera goes to the very end of the dugout, I said, well, he's not here, so obviously he will not play tonight. Sitting in the dressing room on a training table with 2 big bags of ice on his legs, Kirk Gibson. But he's looking at the telecast, and he hears me, and something happens to him. And he hollers to the television, fertilizer! Well, reasonable facsimile. He then called the kid in the locker room, said, tell Tommy I'm coming down. And he came down, and I saw out of the corner of my eye, he was coming up the dugout steps, and I said, well, look who's here. Well, as you know, Kirk Gibson hit the home run. The baseball world went crazy, as did the fans, and the Dodgers went on to win their last World Series until hopefully in the near future. But I've always considered that that's my greatest contribution. I got Kirk Gibson off that bloody table and get up there at the home plate. One last thing, and I don't mean to demean my fellow broadcasters at all, but we don't accomplish anything. We talk about the accomplishments of others. If you are a fight announcer, you are talking about the remarkable Sugar Ray Leonard. If you are a football announcer, you are talking about my favorite, Jim Brown. The point is that we spend our careers talking about others, singing their praises. And I will tell you, after 65 years of singing the praises of all of these great athletes, I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and thank God for hanging around this long. Thank you.